The Airbus A321 XLR recently received its certification and will soon enter service. Boeing's closest equivalent is the 737 MAX 10, but it really can't match the range of the XLR. Now, Boeing has dismissed the XLR as a niche aircraft that they don't really worry about that much, but is that actually true? Well, what I'm going to show you in this video is that even if that turns out to be the case, there is another very similar Airbus that they are much more worried about. And that's partially their own fault. Stay tuned. Many in the aviation industry expected Airbus to announce the final certification of the Airbus A321 XLR during this year's Farnborough Air Show. But as it turns out, EASA, the European regulator, actually ended up granting the new plane its certification a few days before that, on July the 19th. But what exactly is this aircraft, and why does Boeing call it a niche jet? Well, the 321 XLR is essentially an Airbus A321 Neo, which has been specially adapted for long-haul flights thanks to its extra fitted fuel tank. But the interesting thing is that all members of the Airbus A320 family already can be fitted with additional fuel tanks in the cargo hold to essentially achieve the same thing. But the difference here is that those tanks are designed to be removable and therefore called auxiliary center tanks, or ACTs. They come in the shape and size of normal LD-345 cargo containers, making the installation and removal reasonably quick and easy. Now, what sets the Airbus A321 XLR apart is that its extra fuel tank is not an ACT. Instead, it's a permanent part of the structure, located just behind the main landing gear. This new tank is called the rear center tank, or RCT, and it can hold 4 times the amount of fuel of an ACT, while only weighing as much as one of them. And crucially, since it fills the fuselage much better, this tank only takes the space of 2 removable tanks in the hold, which leaves more free space for cargo, and that's worth keeping in mind. Unfortunately, designing and certifying this new fuel tank and the structure around it proved much more challenging than Airbus had first expected. That's mainly because Airbus needed to prove that the RCT would remain protected in case the aircraft would have to perform a belly landing. That meant enlarging the belly fairing by lengthening it rearwards in order to cover the tank, and it also required strengthening this fairing, which is usually just a non-structural aerodynamic cover for the landing gear and other systems. So instead of getting its certification in the second half of 2023, which Airbus had initially expected, the XLR got it just now instead, meaning a delay of just under a year or so. On top of that, there were also some worries that the added drag and weight from the bigger fairing would eat into the advertised range of the XLR, which is 4,700 nautical miles. But Airbus says that the XLR will still keep this range, even after these modifications. Beyond the tank itself, the XLR also has a higher gross weight and slightly more powerful engines, and on top of that it also has modifications to the flaps, cabin layout and emergency exits. But some of those modifications are also available for regular A321 Neo, so really the XLR is all about that bigger fuel tank. So what is Boeing thinking and doing about this new competitor then? Well, the quick answer is not much. As I said in the beginning, Boeing have so far described the XLR as a niche product, which they don't have plans to address head on. Of course, Boeing is right now working to certify the 737 MAX 10, the longest and likely the last 737 ever, unless something really surprising happens, that is. But the MAX 10 isn't really an answer to the XLR. It will have some additional fuel in the fuselage, similar to the 900ER, but this makes its range comparable only to the standard Airbus 321 Neo, not to the XLR. The MAX 10 really only allows Boeing to compete with the Airbus in terms of seat capacity, not range, and even there, the A321 Neo can handle around 10 more passengers than the MAX 10 will. In reality, other than their somewhat similar passenger capacities, the only thing that the Airbus A321 XLR and the Boeing 737 MAX 10 have in common is that they are both the last variants of their respective aircraft families to get certified. So if Boeing aren't that worried about the XLR, then what Airbus model are they worried about? Well, in fact, I've already mentioned it. It's the humble base model A321 Neo itself. That aircraft is actually the reason why Boeing is working so hard on the 737 MAX 10 right now, and it's quite easy to see why. As I've explained in previous videos, the size of aircraft used for any given route has had a tendency to grow over time lately, and this tendency is known as upgauging. And it happens simply because city populations tend to grow over time, and that makes bigger aircraft served by the same crew more profitable. This has meant that before Airbus updated the A320 family with the new engines, the standard A320 was the most popular model in the series, with the others being the A318, the A319 and the A321. But as a result of this gradual upgauging, when Airbus introduced the A320 Neo, or new engine option, the A321 Neo quickly started outselling all of the other variants combined. This also meant that Airbus didn't even bother developing a Neo version of the A318 baby bus, and the slightly bigger A319 Neo barely made any sales at all. And what about Boeing? How have they responded to this trend then? Well, as we know, Boeing have gradually been enlarging the 737 for decades now, but since it sits much lower to the ground than the A320 family does, there are limits to how big they can really make it. The MAX 10 is actually longer than Boeing's old 720, which was a slightly shorter version of the 4-engine Boeing 707. And because of this, the MAX 10 now needs specially articulating landing gear to not scrape the tail on takeoff and landing. But the real problems for Boeing is that today the Airbus A321 Neo is more popular than it has ever been. And with the MAX 10 still not certified, Boeing now have nothing to pit against it. And to add insult to injury, some key Boeing management decisions likely directly contributed to the record sales of the Airbus A321 Neo and its variants that we're now seeing. But before I get into that, did you know that your personal data is right now being bought and sold online by data brokers? Yeah, it really is a thing. But don't take my word for it. Meet Dominic, my awesome editor at Mentour Pilot. A few weeks ago, Dominic found out that his personal information was scattered across hundreds of data brokers' websites, which included his address, social media accounts, and even info about his relatives. So Dominic decided to take control back with today's sponsor, Delete Me, a hands-free service that removes your data from the web. Since signing up, Dominic has seen Delete Me remove his personal info from dozens of sites, like magic. He got a detailed report within a week showing exactly where his data was removed, and the best part? Delete Me continues to scan and delete all year round, so Dominic can focus on what he loves, helping me create awesome videos for you guys, knowing that his privacy is in good hands.
Unbelievable.
But you might wonder, why is this so important? Well, data brokers can make you a target for identity theft and phishing scams, which means that with Delete Me, you're not just removing your info, you're also protecting yourself from these risks. So are you ready to take back your privacy? Well, get 20% off Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/mentornow and use promo code mentornow at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/mentornow, code mentornow. Thank you, Delete Me. And now, where was I? Yes. Remember how I a couple of minutes ago said that since Airbus re-engined the Airbus A320 family, they're now selling more A321 Neos than all other Neo family jets combined? Well, that statement became true already in the first few years after Airbus announced the A320 Neo family over a decade ago. And it technically remains true today, but now the situation is becoming more and more extreme. The biggest single-aisle Airbus isn't just outselling all others combined, it's really outclassing them. In the first half of this year, Airbus reported that the A321 Neo accounted for 93% of all A320 Neo family orders, meaning 9 out of 10, even more than that. So why is this happening? Are all airlines really upgauging their fleets in such a way that it's causing this trend? Well, it's worth remembering here that the A321 Neo isn't just a little bit bigger than the A320 Neo. With an all-economy cabin, the A320 Neo can usually sit around 185 passengers, where the A321 Neo can sit up to 240. Some airlines might be doing this because they are making changes to the networks that call for bigger aircraft. JetBlue, for example, used to have a fleet of mostly legacy A320s, but have so far only placed new orders for A321 Neo, so no 320s at all. But this might also have something to do with their orders of the smaller Airbus, the A220-300. Now, as I'm sure some of you might have already guessed, to understand why the Airbus A321 Neo is getting so popular, we have to talk a bit about the much-loved Boeing aircraft, the beautiful Boeing 757. In October this year, it will be 20 years since the last 757 rolled out of Boeing's production line at Renton. Now, Boeing got a lot of criticism for ending its production, but as I've explained in a previous video, they really had little choice. The aviation slowdown following 9/11 meant that there were simply no more orders for the 757. It was as simple as that. But the airlines that already had 757s in their fleet continued to use them, and later in the 2000s, as the demand for air travel continued to recover, something weird happened. You see, today when we talk about long-haul flights with single-aisle aircraft, we often mention that the 757, with its powerful engines and longer range, was a great example of single-aisle aircraft being used this way. But what some people may not realize is that the 757 only became popular in this role after its production had ended. It was actually the post-9/11 slowdown in travel demand that caused many airlines to start looking for smaller aircraft for their long-haul flights. And this didn't happen immediately after 9/11. Data shows that flights of single-aisle aircraft across the Atlantic, for example, didn't peak until 2012, a full 8 years after the production of the 757 had ended. And that brings us back to Boeing's dismissive comments about the Airbus A321 XLR. That long-haul flights with single-aisle aircraft is a niche idea which might work for some airlines under some circumstances, but won't be the norm for most airlines. Now, they might have a point with that, especially when you add other factors like the extra revenue that airlines can make from cargo, since obviously wide bodies have much more space for that. But all of this begs a question. If the airlines only scaled up transatlantic flights with the 757 after its production ended, then why did these airlines actually buy this plane to start with? How were they using their 757s before discovering their usefulness for long haul? Well, Boeing had intended the 757 to be able to operate in difficult conditions, like in hot and high airports with relatively short runways, but still with plenty of passenger capacity and range. This was a supremely versatile aircraft, which was part of its appeal, especially among pilots, because it's basically the closest an airliner could feel to a muscle car, and Boeing built the 757 this way because they had previously used that same criteria for the 727. But in reality, many airlines with 757s didn't actually need all of that versatility. Many of them simply needed an aircraft that could carry, let's say, around 200 people, and they used the 757s because that was all that was available. Here, I should add that the 757-200, which is by far the most popular 757 variant, carries more or less the same number of passengers as an Airbus A321 Neo does, 240 in an all-economy configuration. And that meant that for many airlines with 757s that were 20 years old or more, the Airbus A321 Neo was an obvious option as a direct replacement. The only possible problem for some airlines was that the range of the A321 Neo wasn't quite as great as the 757s. Maybe you see where this is going. Now, the legacy Airbus A321 had also been an option for the airlines in theory, except it had an even shorter range, and then there was the question of efficiency. You see, in order to work in high-altitude airports in hot summer days, the 757 needed those big engines that it had. But those engines, plus its beefy overall construction, made it much heavier than an A321 Neo, meaning that it was also considerably less efficient. I explained all of this in some detail in one of my older videos if you want to dive into this further. But the point here is that Airbus, especially with the A321 Neo, gave the airlines a great replacement to the super versatile Boeing 757, especially when they also started creating variations with different ranges like the XLR. The base model A321 Neo is the one that carries the maximum number of people, suitable for normal short and medium haul flights. And the Airbus A321 XLR is the one that covers those low-demand, long-haul routes with a reasonable amount of luggage space. The XLR actually even has a slightly longer range than the old 757 did, while also burning less fuel, although the 757 still had a bit more room for cargo. Airbus also has an intermediate option called the A321 LR, which is basically an A321 Neo with a higher gross weight and a belly full of those removable auxiliary fuel tanks that I mentioned before. So, with the Airbus A321 XLR in its fleet, an airline could use a wide body for transatlantic trips to popular destinations during periods of high travel demand, and the XLR for other, less popular destinations at the same time. Then, as high season ends and the airline can't fill their wide bodies on that route, they could just swap in the XLR and still be profitable. In reality, the situation is of course a bit more complicated with variations between weekdays and weekends as well, but you get the point. Being flexible is one of the hardest things to achieve in the airline world and also one of the potentially most lucrative. So the A321 XLR could be a valuable tool to achieve this, especially for smaller airlines using relatively mid-size or small airports as their main hubs. And even bigger airlines could benefit from trip costs that are lower than those of a wide-body fleet when the bigger jets can't be filled. On top of this, the A321 Neo and the XLR obviously also share a type rating, so the pilots can fly both and engineers can service both with the same spare parts, which is a great advantage. Now, a small downside is that the XLR will most likely have a cabin layout with fewer seats, better suited for long haul, that can't quickly be reconfigured to a higher density layout for short and medium haul if needed. Now, to be fair, even if you use one aircraft but both roles, like some airlines did with the 757 for example, you'd still have to deal with a less than ideal cabin if you need to swap jets at the last minute. So in practice, having a pair of similar aircraft for different roles should be the best choice for most airlines. But in a perfect world, the airlines would have an aircraft that would be purpose-built for both the range and the passenger numbers, making it a nice proper 757 replacement. Basically, a new mid-size aircraft, which is exactly what Boeing planned to do when it studied what it called the New Mid-Size Airplane, or NMA, back during the last decade. And here is where we get to the Boeing decision that might have launched the A321 Neo into the stratosphere. You see, the planning for the NMA took place before the terrible 737 MAX crashes in 2018 and 19, and after that, in January of 2020, Dave Calhoun became the new Boeing CEO and simply cancelled the NMA project as part of an effort to fix Boeing's spiraling financial issues. At the time, with the 737 MAX still grounded and Boeing facing loads of other problems, that decision made a lot of sense, at least in the short term. But the problem was that in November of 2022, with the 737 MAX back in the skies and some sort of post-pandemic recovery on the horizon, Calhoun still repeated the same thing. He was adamant that Boeing's next airliner would not enter service before 2035 and that Boeing wouldn't even begin designing it during this decade. Now that statement had far-reaching effects both for the airlines and for their fleet plans. At the time, many airlines still wanted to see what Boeing would do next before doing any big aircraft purchases in the mid-size category. Again, the Airbus A321 Neo and the XLR were good options, but not necessarily ideal for everyone, and on top of that, Airbus had long delivery times for new aircraft orders. So the airlines didn't necessarily want to lock themselves into an Airbus A321 Neo fleet if there was a chance that a newer and even better Boeing was just over the horizon. Calhoun's November 2022 statement obviously changed that. There was no new shiny Boeing on the way, and sure enough, in 2023, Airbus recorded a staggering 1,300 orders for the Airbus A321 Neo. Now, Boeing did sell some 737 MAX 10s during that period, but in much lower numbers. As I said before, it really can't compete with the Airbus A321 Neo on neither range nor passenger capacity, and the extra flexibility of the Airbus fleet means that today Airbus has a backlog of nearly 5,000 orders for 321 Neos, including the XLR, and Boeing has just over 1,000 orders for the MAX 10. Oh, how different it might have been if the NMA would have stayed on the table, or at least wouldn't have been completely dismissed. It's also worth remembering here that Boeing currently has a huge gap in its aircraft lineup between the 737 MAX 10 and the next bigger plane, the 787-8. The 757 and the 767 would have been in between them, but they're now both gone, and that's while Airbus has a much smaller gap between the A321 Neo and the Airbus A330-800. Now, to be fair to Boeing here, developing an all-new jet family that could replace the 737, the 757 and even the smaller end of the 767 would be a complicated and very expensive task to pull off. Figuring out how to size such an aircraft family to fulfill so many roles would be a nightmare and will most likely require a pair of aircraft designs, similar to how Boeing developed the 757 and the 767 back in the 1980s. And another big complication here that I haven't even mentioned yet is the engines. There is currently no modern engine option for an aircraft the size of a 757, but CFM, Pratt & Whitney and even Rolls-Royce are currently working on newer engines that could enter service in the coming years and would potentially fit. Now, of course, there are loads of more issues to discuss here that could influence future airline fleet decisions, like whether or not the airlines will continue to upgauge their fleets and by how much. Different manufacturers and analysts make different projections based on things like limited airport slots in busy airports that could potentially favor even bigger planes in general, kind of like how the original reasoning went behind the Airbus A380. But as we learned from that, it's very hard to plan for travel demand and patterns that far into the future. This is all discussions for another video, but the point that I want to make here is that Airbus didn't outsmart Boeing with the A321 Neo or the XLR. Instead, Boeing essentially quit the mid-sized aircraft market. If they would have continued with the NMA, it's likely that this new design with new engines and lightweight materials would have outclassed the A321 Neo, and that would have therefore forced Airbus to develop something completely new on its own. Also, can you believe it's been 20 years since the last new 757 rolled off the production line? In my view, that's way too long for Boeing to have effectively abandoned this segment of the market. But what do you think? Does Boeing today have the means to reignite its engineering glory days and give Airbus a run for their money? Let me know in the comments below or in our next Zoom hangout if you are part of my Patreon crew. Now, consider supporting me by supporting my sponsor using the links here below, where you can also find some cool merch and other really cool stuff. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.